Hello, everyone. Sorry that I'm a little late today. I got carried away reading about the Nazis, and I forgot to do the actual work that I need to do to give this talk. Hello, Ben's grandpa. I'm glad you figured it out. Welcome to the stream. And hello to everyone else. Thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in for this talk. Before I begin, a couple of disclaimers, I guess. I'm going to be talking about Nazis tonight and things that Nazis do. And there will be Nazi imagery, like what you see over there, or over there. So if that is concerning to you, and it might be, and if that's going to bother you, consider this a content warning. I'm not going to dwell on too much of the nightmare stuff, and this talk is going to end well before the worst things. But it is going to discuss anti-Semitism and a bunch of other stuff. So just a heads up. This is also not, in case you were tuning in for this, a chronicle of Hitler's rise to power or the Nazi Party in general. I'm going to be talking about those things, but this is really about the Sturmabteilung, the SA is what I'm going to call them from here on out. The Nazi Brownshirts, Stormtroopers, is what they were. And I'm particularly interested in this group for reasons that I hope will become clear as we talk about them in greater detail. But that is the focus of tonight's talk. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into it. So hit me with your questions, and I'll answer them as best I can. But I'm just gonna do it. We're just gonna talk. Here we go. So our story begins, or this sort of chunk of history begins with the end of World War I, the defeat of Imperial Germany, the Treaty of Versailles, and all these things. The Stormtroopers were a unit that had existed in World War II and had a history as sort of a special operations and infiltration corps, but they did not become significant in the way that they would in the Weimar Republic until after the Treaty of Versailles, which, as I'm sure any student of history knows, this is one of the things that you probably were taught in school, was deeply painful and humiliating to Germany. 100 and they call themselves a lot of things, but the official name was Sturmabteilung, the Stormtroopers. I think they had some other designations, but that's what they, yes, the Wiener Republic. Absolutely correct. Republic full of wieners. Sorry, I got distracted. The things that happened to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, quick rundown. They had to repay 132 billion gold marks, which is around $31 billion today in reparations. Germany did not have this money, so they printed a lot of marks. And again, we all know about the hyperinflation that happened in the Weimar Republic between 1918 and 1924. People pushing around wheelbarrows full of marks to buy bread. People using old marks to wallpaper. $1 trillion banknotes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The treaty also required Germany to permanently reduce the size of its army to 100,000 men, destroy all their tanks, their air force, their U-boat fleet. This led to a lot of resentment from ordinary Germans who felt like this was unfair, and created a very popular legend of being stabbed in the back, as sort of this idea that Germany had been betrayed, especially by sort of the German elites and by potential outside agitators, Jews specifically. The conspiracy theory of this betrayal was pretty common among Germans. Germans all along the political spectrum believed in this idea of betrayal and came to see themselves as victims. Again, this is not unique to the Nazis or to the right side of the German political spectrum. This is something that a lot of Germans feel, a lot of ordinary Germans feel. And during the war, shortly after the war, things were pretty rowdy in Germany. It was occupied by the Allies, and they were disbanding, and various chunks were being bitten off and given away. The Rhineland was returned to France. Big chunks of Poland were given back. Bits and pieces were given to Denmark and elsewhere. And a lot of the soldiers from World War I returned and joined up with paramilitary organizations called the Freikorps. And these Freikorps were involved in a lot of things, and they were angry and they were violent. A lot of them felt like the defeat was sort of abrupt, and so they sort of just turned their military might and anger on whoever was around, and this was most often communists. There were communist uprisings in Bavaria, in Hamburg, and elsewhere. There was very briefly a Bavarian Soviet. I think it lasted like a month. But in addition to sort of crackdown by the greatly limited official German army, the Freikorps were turned on these communists and socialists in Germany, but also in the Baltics, Silesia, Poland, East Prussia. And they were very, very successful against this. They also fought in sort of border skirmishes against Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. They were officially disbanded in 1920, but a lot of post-World War I soldiers found meaning and camaraderie and excitement and fulfillment in being a part of the Freikorps, and we're looking for something else when the official reason for those paramilitary groups was gone. Enter the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which grew out of the German Workers' Party. In 1921, it changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party to appeal to sort of the growing left-wing socialist, anti-capitalist worker sentiment in Germany. It didn't want to appear to not be pro-worker, so it adopted the socialist moniker over the objections of many people, including one Adolf Hitler, who had become quite popular and powerful within the party. The ideological origins of the National Socialist German Workers' Party were explicitly anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, anti-Marxist, anti-liberal, and also sort of anti-capitalist. But as I'll talk about a little bit later, not really. And there were other powerful people in the Nazi Party, but from 1921 onward, it is essentially Hitler's party. And it is explicitly all those things I mentioned. So this is not the purpose of this lecture, but I want to touch on it briefly. The Nazi Party was not in any way, shape, or form socialist, despite the fact that it has the word socialist in the name. This was purely a branding strategy to appeal to the working class people they were trying to recruit. It was explicitly anti-Marxist, anti-socialist, and as we'll see, very enthusiastically and violently fought actual socialists and communists in the Weimar Republic. I know that you are all smart people and are not confused by the, sometimes words don't mean what they actually mean, but this is a thing that comes up a lot, so I just want to sort of like explicitly say, in no way, shape, or form, not even in like, nobody believed that the Nazis were socialists, including themselves. Anyway, just gonna put that out there. So Around this time, a lot of the ex-soldiers, the Freikorps veterans, as well as young men, men that were sort of called the children of the war, who had been too young to fight but were deeply shaped by World War One, were recruited into the Stormtrooper Corps, into the SA. And the intent of the SA initially was influenced like very deeply by both communist and the Social Democratic Party's attempts to create their own self-protection forces, their own sort of, I guess, paramilitaries. Germany, right after the creation of the Weimar Republic, was a pretty rough place. There was a lot of violence in the streets. There was still a lot of big questions about how the aftermath of World War One was going to shake out, and so there were a lot of paramilitary organizations, some political in certain ways and others, and the Nazis saw that the communists and the Social Democrats were creating sort of their own enforcement units and said, well, we got to do that too. And it was initially sort of just it was a paramilitary organization, but it was more of just a party club, not necessarily like a explicit army. And it drew from a lot of it drew from workers, but it also drew like pretty heavily from middle class suburban Germans, or whose young men whose parents had been suburban, urban and middle class, and were facing down a increasingly limited set of opportunities for themselves. And it was immediately a disruptive and sort of violent force. It was involved in a lot of clashes early on, but partly due to the strength of sort of the Nazi Party's propaganda, and because of inherent ideological alliances, a lot of parts of the sort of the judiciary, the police, and the upper middle classes saw this sort of radicalism and violence as defensive actions, right? Responses to the ongoing threat of Bolshevik agitation, the threat of communist takeover of Germany, and just an unfortunate consequence of what was perceived as social disorder. So initially, these groups of SA are they begin to wear the brown shirts, they carry weapons, they march in the streets, and they sort of have the explicit goal of intimidating and provoking conflict with their opponents, specifically communists, social democrats, and increasingly Jewish Germans and Jewish business owners. But more on that later. In 1923, as again, I'm sure, they were so proud. They were so proud of themselves. We'll talk about how proud they were in a little bit. But yes, they were very excited to be a part of the SA. But in 1923, Adolf Hitler attempts to seize power in Munich. On the 8th and 9th of November. 2,000 Nazis march to the city center, and they try to declare a coup and take over. It doesn't work. A bunch of Nazis are killed. Hitler gets wounded. He gets arrested. He's charged with treason. This is called the Beer Hall Putsch. I'm sorry. The other thing I should have said at the beginning is that my German is not great. I'm going to mispronounce things. Anyway, this brings Hitler to the attention of the German nation, and he gets front page headlines and a 24-day trial, which is publicized, and Hitler gets to rant and rave and say a bunch of things in front of all of Germany. He's sentenced to 5 years in prison for treason. Seems light, but what do I know? I'm an American. But he only served 9 months, and then From here on out, Hitler is committed to, again, what he says is a legal takeover of Germany rather than a revolution or a forceful coup. And so he begins to develop Nazi propaganda. This has an impact on the SA because the SA, at least portions of it, see themselves as a paramilitary group with the intent and purpose of overthrowing the Weimar Republic, which they see as illegitimate, or many of them see as illegitimate, run by, again, Jews, Bolsheviks, internationalists, traitors, cowards, betrayers of the German nation. But for the time being, they're willing to play along with Hitler's plans and work within sort of the system. And there's some interesting ways in that they do this. So the Nazi Party is briefly banned, and the SA has to operate in secret. The Brownshirts are, they're banned, but they just wear different shirts. And after about a year or so, the Nazi Party is reinstated. The Brownshirts can operate in public again. It doesn't stick. So from 1924, 1925 to 1933, this is sort of like the Nazi rise to power, and it's also sort of the height of the brown shirt influence. And during this time, they do a lot of different things, and the purpose of the SA is really, really interesting. They are explicitly, an organization within the Nazi Party, but each of sort of the SA commanders within their various regions is given a lot of autonomy. And like Hitler himself, a lot of them have substantial personal charisma, and they build strong relationships with their followers, and they create these sort of these cells and mini cults of personality. And their primary job, their primary purpose, is to sort of provoke a reaction. They march through neighborhoods where they know that they'll be opposed. They protest or agitate outside of Jewish businesses. They go to places where there are communists or SPD, Socialist Party, Socialist Democratic Party organizers, and try to get them to fight back. And then they call in their buddies, and then there's a big street battle. And this seems like sort of like random stochastic violence, and it is, but there's also an explicit like strategy to this, and one, it gets attention, right? It draws attention to the SA and to the Nazi Party. Not always good attention, but it gets them headlines. And there's an element of playing the refs here, which is really interesting. The police, can't or don't want to be seen to be taking sides, so they have to sort of like keep the peace. But a lot of them explicitly or implicitly have ideological or actual personal sympathy towards the SA, and so whenever the cops show up, the SA tend to get off with sort of like a slap on the wrist, and all the communists get arrested. They essentially, due to sort of the restrictions of what they need to do, end up being sort of a protective force for the Nazis during their propaganda marches. They also, as like part of a deliberate strategy here, reach out to the police officers. They highlight their grievances, right? The abuse at the hands of the government, which forces them to clean up all the messes that the Democratic Party is responsible for. While their opponents, the communists, are, saying the cops are henchmen of the system, dupes of the capitalist establishment, traitors to their own class, things that might be true, but don't really endear the cops to the Nazis' opponents. There's also sort of like a tolerance from the establishment, the business class, the judiciary, the military. Despite the fact that the SA's practices were at least as violent and aggressive as those of their competitors, a lot of the good, like established upper class Germans, just saw political violence left as a serious threat to law and order, whereas Nazi violence was it's regretful but necessary and it's an ultimately legitimate means of national self-defense. I kind of glossed over this because I've been steeped in this all day, but it was also everything was like all of this is explicitly nationalist, all about the German nation, and the the only really like consistent thing in Nazi ideology is sort of the purity and greatness of Germany, of the German nation, of the German people. And again, what that actually means is sort of subservient to the needs of the Nazi Party. It's not really like an ideological position with any meaning, but just, these are nationalists. These are hardcore nationalists. And so even people who might find them sort of distasteful or their methods problematic, see a potential alliance with them because of a shared love of the German nation and a belief in German greatness. So one interesting member of the SA is was a military officer named Ernst Röhm, and I want to dwell on him for just a moment because he's interesting and he'll be important later. But he was a military officer in World War I, joined the SA and the Nazi Party in the early 1920s, and rose to become leader of the whole organization. But after the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler changed his plans, as I mentioned. But Röhm still believed that that the SA could be and was a paramilitary organization with the intent of sort of overthrowing the government by force. And Röhm and Hitler disagreed on this, and Röhm wanted to explicitly integrate some other paramilitary organizations into the SA and agitate more towards that direct goal. And in 1925, he disagreed. He had sort of like a disagreement so strong with Hitler that he resigned from everything, left public life. He went to Bolivia and served in the Bolivian army, which is what you see here. But in 1930, Hitler called him and returned him to Germany. Rome is also where he resumed leadership of the SA. Rome is also interesting in that he was a gay man, and this was it was something he kept secret, but it became much less of a secret when some of his personal correspondence was published. And I wanted to bring this up because there are a handful of notable homosexuals in the SA, Röhm, Heinz, and Karl Ernst, which led to this sort of weird historiographic thing about a network of sordid homosexuality in the SA, but this isn't really true. But it is interesting that Röhm ended up in the position there where he was for so long, and Hitler was well aware of this, as was all the leadership. And the Nazi Party was like everything, plenty homophobic, and would eventually, incarcerate, execute, and castrate thousands of homosexuals. But Röhm still saw this as a pathway to what he wanted, was sort of like a restoration of German power, German unity, the German nation. More on him later. Anyway, so for the latter half of the 1930s, the SA is growing in power. It goes from thousands of members to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of members. And there's, the Nazi Party is simultaneously growing in power, and there are elections, and they do not so great in a couple, and in 1928, there's a pretty, weak showing. But in 1930, federal elections are held, and the Nazi Party dramatically increases its seats from 12 to 107. The largest party is still the Social Democratic Party. The third largest are the Communists, actually, with 23. But this is a big boost for the Nazis. It brings them into serious consideration. They've been treated as sort of like a joke for a long time, but they're substantially more powerful. And at the same time, there's substantial unemployment, social unrest, depression in Germany. Here you can see the military feeding people. It is a rough time. The number of unemployed people in Germany rises to over 6 million. There's hunger and discontent, and the government is doing very little to manage it. This turns out to be a fertile opportunity for both the Nazis and the SA. Actually, a huge number of people join the SA during this time simply because of the potential employment opportunities, because of the mutual aid that it provided, or just to have something to do. Huge proportions of the SA in various cities were unemployed, and were just became involved with it because of a lack of other options. So I want to dwell briefly on sort of like the ideology of the Nazis and the SA, because as a lot of people smarter than me and who've been looking at this a lot longer than me have pointed out, it seems bizarre that such a huge proportion of Germany's population would throw their lot in with an explicitly anti-Semitic and loathsome and violent party and group of people. Who you're looking at here is Gregor Strasser, who was a member of the Nazi Party, and if you're one of the leftists who listens to me, you might be vaguely familiar with Strasserism or Gregor Strasser, but there was an element of anti-capitalism, like I mentioned, an appeal to worker solidarity, an attempt to criticize the big business and the powerful corporations and the internationalists, to appeal to working class people. But it was always explicitly a right-wing party. And so people like Strasser argued for a radical mass action worker-based Nazism, which was more about economic anti-Semitism rather than just regular anti-Semitism. Still about nationalism, still about the superiority of the German nation, still about a national rebirth. And it was also, completely in line with sort of, Nazi Christian nationalism. A lot of these early stormtroopers saw themselves as Christian crusaders fighting against a godless and pagan Jewish republic. As is well documented, like later on, the Nazis, took sort of a anti-church tone, but early on, there was a lot of integration with both certain Catholic and especially Protestant denominations. And there's, a lot of the thing that I sort of want to emphasize is that the ideology of Nazism and fascism in general is very malleable, right? And the SA were later on explicitly forbidden from discussing or arguing about their political affiliations. They were just supposed to be out there, look tough, protect the Nazis, and beat up communists. They were not expected to really have strong political opinions. And so, in a lot of ways, this was a social movement, a social club, a form of camaraderie, a place to go, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. But, for a while, and there's a moment when this becomes not true a little bit later on, boy, people keep saying stuff about Proud and boys, and I don't know what, I've just got no idea what they're talking about. I have no idea what sort of parallels you might draw between these and whoever these Proud Boys are. But anyway, moving on. But for a while, the Nazis contained some like left wing elements and right wing elements and centrists. In the Night of the Long Knives, this is all sort of purged pretty radically. But they Hitler and his leadership, avoid driving out these elements because it's useful to them for a while. Speaking of the Proud Boys, there was also there's also an element of let's see, chastity is the wrong word, but sort of austerity and asceticism, and staying away from women specifically. The young men of the SA were expected to impress the public with their discipline and determination, acting as an example of a glorious past and as the embodiment of a national regeneration. But they needed to remain at a distance. So, their wives and children were prohibited from joining them on the marches, and any form of intimacy or conflict over the men's loyalties was kept away from them. They were also intended to repress both natural instincts and middle class ideas of intimacy, like they were supposed to live above the level of men who sought sensual pleasure from women. Instead, the Proud Boys were called to respect the honor of German workers, German women and girls, their parents, and even the churches. No SA man was allowed to socialize with a girl who wears un-German clothes. It's important, the SA were Volcels, not incels, but yes, otherwise that's correct. They got their hands on a magical ancient Tibetan artifact. Anyway, how much this was true is questionable, but there was an idea that they were above such base instincts. They did not go so far as publicly and weirdly refusing to masturbate, like nobody that we're talking about tonight does, but you can definitely see some similarities there. I chose this picture, though, because women were involved. Women were, at first, there was no real prescription, but later on, it was clear that women were not allowed to be a part of the SA, but they still participated as part of, again, sort of this German project of national regeneration, and they were happy to do so. They sometimes fought, they sewed uniforms, they cooked and cared for the men. So I really don't want to let German women off the hook here. But the SA was an explicitly masculine organization in intent, and it was it was based on a lot of these ideas of voluntary celibacy, basically. But what was really appealing about the SA, about being a part of it, was that, truthfully, these were young men without options. These were young men without a future, who had been either explicitly or were perceived as having been abandoned by their nation, by their leadership, betrayed, as we mentioned. And Nazi propaganda constantly reminded the Stormtrooper that he was part of a bigger picture, right? He was an eyewitness to a crucial period in history that he could actually and personally shape. One Stormtrooper recalled that for the first time in his life, he felt fully accepted as a human being. These were places where a person could go to get their basic needs met, like a network of more or less reliable comrades, food and shelter, and a sense of belonging. And these were not the only places where you could go and get that. There were similar organizations on the left, but this was explicitly the project of the SA. And there was an element of this, and the author that I read most extensively on this really hammers this point home, but the violence is a part of it. There was something exciting and joyful and binding about being part of this proscribed violence, right? It was, up until around 1933, it was, people did die. A lot of people did die, but it was mostly restrained. It would involve truncheons and sticks. So when the SA was doing well, which was in the later part of the 1930s and the early 1920s and early 1930s, a part of the project was sort of an informal network of providing for young men who were out of work or who needed food and shelter. And so sometimes this would mean you would be put up in an actual SA member's home. Sometimes they would find a place for you at a shelter or a community hall. Later on, when they get more power, the SA was very much an employment network. So if you wanted a job, being a part of the SA would make that a lot more likely. It was not it wasn't explicitly about providing food and shelter, but informally it did for a lot of especially the young men who were unemployed and struggling in the early 1930s. That was not, again, the out-and-out goal, but it's in the same sense that if you were part of the group, somebody would take care of you, right? If you were a member of the SA, you were one of them. You were one of their brothers, and so somebody would find food for you, somebody would find a place for you to sleep. And this was something that a lot of Germans needed in the early 1930s. And, there was an idea, and this was explicitly pushed by the Nazis, that the SA would be members of a new elite, right, that would throw down traditional social hierarchies, which would get rid of the bankers and the businessmen and the aristocracy and the Jews, and that the new vigorous working German man would be the leader of the nation. And so, though this failed to materialize, it was often sort of a binding and perceived way for the SA to go forward. So, I've mentioned the vaguely, or the sort of some of the anti-capitalist, I guess, ideas or gestures of the Nazis in the SA, but in reality, it was not so. There were close ties between big business and the SA, sometimes extremely explicit. This is one particularly interesting one. In 1930, a Dresden businessman, Dressler, started a cigarette company, which has a really long name, but it was mostly known as Sturm. Storm. And it became basically the cigarette of the SA. And for a while, it was actually forbidden for the SA to smoke any other form of cigarette. The most popular one was the drummer cigarette, which you see here. And the leadership of the SA even searched bags and imposed fines for disobedience. A share of the company's profits was handed over to the SA, and in return, the SA smoked Sturm exclusively. Fascinatingly, I want to show you this. On this poster here, you can see that it says Gegen Trust und Konzern, against trust and big business, which is just too good, just too funny. Another major business partner of the SA is, of course, Hugo Boss, who you may have heard of. Before he made uniforms for the SS, he made uniforms for the SA. And Hugo Boss, I think, went bankrupt briefly and then came back and made more Brownshirts. But their initial uniforms were designed and created by Hugo Boss. And so these are just two main examples, but big business did not have a problem with the Nazis and did not have a problem with the SA, despite their sort of overtures of anti-capitalism and, being pro-worker. It was really just a sort of hyper-capitalist and, form of cronyism most of the time. So in 1932, there's another parliamentary election, and the Nazis receive the largest portion of votes. And Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Almost immediately afterwards, the Reichstag building, the parliamentary building, mysteriously catches on fire. How weird. And the Nazis use this as a pretext to hunt down all of the awful communists and socialist agitators who are responsible for undermining the German government. Now, for a long time, the historiographic consensus was this was set by sort of an individual Dutch anarchist, but the historian Benjamin Hett has argued pretty convincingly, and I believe that this is the case. However, I also want to explicitly say that this is not settled history and there's still some questions, but it seems pretty clear that the SA was responsible for setting the Reichstag fire on the orders of Karl Ernst and Hermann Göring. So, in the sort of the immediate months after the Nazi takeover of power, the SA goes on a just a rampage. They're basically set loose, and they're responsible for, during this period, basically rounding up anyone who is suspected of being a communist, of being a social democrat, some Jews, but mostly it's political prisoners at this point in time. The Nazis put together blacklists, and the SA is responsible for gathering up these people and taking them into basically a patchwork of illegal prisons. In most of the German cities, there are cellars of SA taverns, sports facilities, youth hostels, barracks, and deserted factories, where these prisoners are taken for the time being. And the project of the SA in this immediate post-takeover period is to humiliate and break down the political opposition to the Nazis. And so there's, these communist and SPD party members or sympathizers are beaten for hours, threatened with execution. They're forced to polish the boots of the SA guards, drink their urine. They are forced in certain camps to shout anti-Semitic slogans while being beaten with rods, straps, and truncheons. Sometimes they were forced to do things like brush the ground with toothbrushes or clean the camp toilets with their bare hands. They were forced to do sports for the SA guards, again, while they were often completely too injured or weak to walk. At one prison, they were given swimming lessons, in quotes here, by draping a rope around the prisoner's neck and then lifting up to a height at which the victim could barely stand, and then they began to flail about. Thousands of people are interned and hundreds killed during this immediate post-takeover period, and this pales in comparison to what the Nazis do later. But I wanted to bring it up because this is explicitly, the SA is let loose, right? And there's an element of frustration because they got what they wanted, and yet they feel still sort of like they've been shut out of the halls of power. A lot of the people who were elevated to important positions in the Nazi Party or the new Reich government are new members who joined after the 1932 elections. And there's a frustration among the SA. They feel like they've been struggling and working hard and fighting for a decade or more, and so plus without an explicit enemy to fight, there isn't much for the SA to do, and so they're set loose to sort of deal with political enemies, and they do so in a very effective way. But the problem with the SA becomes clear to Hitler and to others immediately after this. And so they come up with a solution. And so we have Ernst Röhm here again in the front. So on the 30th of June in 1932, there is what is called the Night of the Long Knives. And so there's still some question marks about what happened here and who's behind it, but essentially Ernst Röhm, Gregor Strasser, and a bunch of other people in the SA and in the Nazi Party are either driven out of Germany or more likely executed in the case of Röhm. And the people behind this are probably Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and Werner von Blomberg, one of the generals of the Reichswehr, the German army, who saw that there was who felt threatened by the SA, and for some reason, they felt that there was conflicting interests between the SA, that they were uncontrollable, that they would challenge sort of the more organized parts of the Nazi Party and the Nazi project. And so Röhm and others were sort of unceremoniously gathered up, executed. Huge chunks of the SA leadership were purged, and the SA was profoundly criticized and shamed by this. Hitler declared, the SA men should be leaders, not abominable apes. And the SA did not disappear after this, which is often a common misconception. It was reconstituted, and it kept around, or it maintained some political position, but it was no longer involved in the street fighting. Right? It no longer had an enemy to fight. Right? All of the communists had been purged. Pretty soon, all of the other political enemies, to the extent that they existed, would be put into concentration camps. And so without sort of a outlet for their random, stochastic, their violence, they were a liability. And there was also, the issue was that this was not really a left-wing group, but it was ostensibly somewhat aligned with labor. And so there was the Night of the Long Knives accomplished two things, right? It destroyed any viability of any sort of labor movement, left, right, or center, and any sort of autonomous paramilitary, right movement that might challenge Hitler from one direction or another. And there's a lot that I didn't talk about, and this is obviously kind of like a dissatisfying moment to end on, because obviously what comes after is it's a lot of stuff. But I think the Brownshirts and I think the Stormtroopers are really, really interesting, and I could have talked about them for probably another hour or two, and maybe I'll go into greater detail. But I did say in my email, and I try to make a point that you shouldn't draw too many obvious conclusions between history and the present. But as I was reading about the Brownshirts, I was just there are uncanny similarities between these people and some modern day imitators, intentional or otherwise. And I think that often we misunderstand fascism and the appeal of fascism. I don't have anything good to say about any of the members of the SA. I don't think any of them were good people, but I don't think that they were all, frothing at the mouth, anti-Semites. A lot of them were just hooligans and bullies and ruffians, and they liked being a part of something, and they liked beating up people who were not them, and they liked being part of the in-group. And there's a lot of appeal to that. And so I think sometimes in our modern day conversation, when we talk about the Nazis, we imagine sort of like a uniform group of powerfully evil, mustache twirling villains, when it does not take that to want to do evil things, right? People, a lot of these guys were they were bored, they were lonely, they were, they wanted to be a part of something, they felt betrayed, they felt angry, and the SA gave them an opportunity and a place to sort of vent those frustrations. And I don't have any sort of, I don't have anything good thing to say one way or another about that, but it's something that you have to sort of be aware of, when you're looking at this period in history. It does not take some unit of highly evil monster dudes to do evil things. It just kind of takes, the lesson that I keep coming back to with history is if you get a bunch of unemployed, angry young men together, bad things happen. This is one of the key instigators for most, if not all, social crises in history. So, I mean, that's like what I'm getting at here. Like the Proud Boys lack the organization and the official sort of connection to any sort of political party, but they're just like this. They'd love this shit. That this is exactly what they want. I have stood face to face with Proud Boys more times than I care to admit, and they're just fucking goons. They're just bullies. Some of them are absolute like nationalist fascists. A lot of them, they just love getting dressed up and shouting at socialists and Antifa and feeling big and strong. They just fucking love it. And in that way, they're exactly like the SA. If if things get worse and they grow and there's not an alternative and the powers that be fail to address them and that we fail to I guess peel off the ones that are reachable, then you get the SA. And again, I'm not here to offer prescriptions. I'm just saying that the Proud Boys, they have some analogs in history, and it's, there are a lot of things that are different, right? They don't have like official ties to any sort of political party, but in the way that they act and the things that they value and sort of their sort of lack of real ideology aside from owning the libs, they're just like the SA, aside from being like vague nationalists in a very, very general sense. I mean, you have to offer them something, right? Like I know that we're all good libs and you're supposed to believe that you just come with like the right ideas and the right arguments that people will see the light, but that's not how it works. You have to offer them something. Like you have to make things better somehow. Like you have to make jobs better, you have to make the economy better, you have to give them something to believe in or belong to. So individually, there are some ways that we can do that. Politically, that means stopping the gutting of social services and the working class and the eroding of any sort of future for young people in America. But also you got to beat the shit out of them. I don't know. Like they should be opposed like physically at every point. And it's a multifaceted approach, right? Like they have to be opposed at every way. I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but like when I was reading about this, every single person was like, we should have taken the SA more seriously. And the Proud Boys are goofs. There's not very many of them, but I do not think that we should. I think we should take them very, very seriously. And I don't think that there is a response that is too extreme. I think that you should show up in force and run them out of town. I'm going to stop short of saying explicitly how you should do that because I don't want to get in trouble. But I'm just saying nobody from any part of the political spectrum, that I was reading about in their memoirs was like, gosh, we should just let the Nazis be. We should just let the SA wander around. Everyone was like, we should have fought harder. That's the thing is like if people are miserable, right? And the only thing that brings them joy is being part of a group of hooligans. Find something else to bring them joy. Give them something else to be a group of, right? Give them another opportunity to do something, right? Like, anyway, that's it. The other thing is that, some of these people are unreachable, and there's always going to be, there's always going to be like Nazi sympathizers and Proud Boys or whatever. But like, you can make them like they respond to power, like, and if you make them look weak, that matters. And if you embarrass them publicly, that matters. And if you make it uncool to be a part of it, that matters. But, ultimately it's material. Ultimately you have to give them something else, or they're gonna, something like this will pop up, I guess. Anyway, thanks for everybody listening to me talk about Brownshirts and Proud Boys and all that. This was really interesting, and I don't know, I might come back to it because there's like a lot more to talk about, and there's a bunch of horrible people but very interesting people involved in this. I don't know, maybe I'll talk about the Italian version of this at some point. The black shirts are really interesting and might be a better analog for our Proud Boys. But anyway, stay safe out there, everybody. Stay warm, stay healthy. I know that this is the worst part of the pandemic for everybody. So take care of yourself, and I'll be back next week or the week after. Not sure what I'm going to talk about yet, but thanks, everybody. And, sorry, this is a good question. Sorry. The media was covering the essay. It was, I mean, the truth is that it's kind of like how our media covers it. Like, they were, critical. Some parts of the media were critical, and very much so. Others were sympathetic, and it kind of depended on which political side of the political spectrum they're aligned with. The German press, I don't know enough about this to be super precise, but the German press was pretty robust. They did not take the essay seriously early on. I think that was a mistake. Yes, there were big fights between the communists and the SA, and between the SA and the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, the main party, and they were pretty violent. And the communists, this was the thing that. Sorry, I'm going on. This was the thing that sort of gave me pause, because the communists gave as good as they got in several fights, and they killed a bunch of SA in the late 1920s. But this just sort of got rolled into sort of a national or a myth of both the SA and the Nazi Party. So it's clear that just fighting them isn't by itself enough. It is clear from both what they wrote and what everybody else wrote that they thought they should have fought more. But even showing up in equal numbers and fighting the SA was not enough to stop their rise.